How big a mistake was it for the Falcons to pass on Lamar Jackson last offseason? And what did they learn from that mistake that is going to inform their choice of quarterback this offseason?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. Mr. Drew. My friends call me Negative Nancy, but you can call me Mr. Drew. But you can become my friend by becoming an everydayer of this illustrious podcast. And all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So normally today's episode would be an all 22 review, but that unfortunately will have to wait because the all 22 on NFL Plus was not available Monday night or Tuesday morning, as it usually is most weeks, most likely due to the holiday. And so basically I have to punt that until I do get access to that. And whenever I do get access to the all 22, I will break it down and then we will do a podcast. And hopefully you guys get that episode between now and the crossover on Wednesday night, but we will just sort of have to see, right? As I often say, you can only control what you can control, and I can't control when I get to watch the all 22, but I can control what type of content I give you. And so instead, we're going to talk about sort of more big picture stuff rather than the most recent game or the upcoming Falcons game. And, you know, the topic du jour at least seems to be, talking about the Falcons' decision to pass on Lamar Jackson. And this is kind of a byproduct. I think every time Lamar and the Ravens are in prime time, this, conversation is going to come back up. I saw some of the fallout on Tuesday morning on Twitter and elsewhere. And this is part of the reason why I think Twitter is such a rotten place to have discourse on this sport, because it kind of oversimplifies the conversation, right? And I think a lot of people present it as if the Falcons had two choices and they at quarterback, and it was like Lamar Jackson or Desmond Ridder, and the Falcons just went with Desmond Ridder. And that's not really the situation, right? The reality was the Falcons went with Desmond Ridder plus 2 first-round picks, plus, over $180 million in guaranteed money, which is, over the next 3 or so years, which works out to be a little less than like 20% of their salary cap over the next 3 or so years, plus David Onyemata, plus Jesse Bates, plus Caden Ellis over Lamar Jackson. And, it was basically if you do want to simplify, it was the choice of, do we build up the rest of the team or do we try to solve the quarterback problem, right? And I think the Falcons personally, and again, I'm sure there are plenty of people that disagree. Clearly, there are plenty of people that disagree. I think the Falcons made the correct choice in building up the team rather than just solving the quarterback, right? We've talked about this a ton, right? Yes, solving the quarterback problem is one of the biggest problems you have to solve as an organization, as a football team. It's the most important problem you got to solve, but it's only one problem, right? And I think one of the lessons that I tried to reiterate on this podcast a year ago is that one of the lessons we learned from the 14 years of Matt Ryan is that having a good quarterback doesn't solve all your problems. And essentially the conversation with Lamar Jackson was the Falcons had to, in all those things I talked about the Falcons choosing over, they would have had to invest like 5 problems worth of assets to solve one problem, which was the quarterback. And you're still only solving one problem and you're not solving the other 4 problems. And I think the way that people tend to think about it is, hey, if you solve the quarterback problem, it's, you're chipping away at the other 4 problems, or that can mask the other 4 problems. And that's not really how it works. But that will be a debate for another day. But that gets us to the conversation of the Falcons' current quarterback problem, which was not solved this past offseason with Desmond Ridder. And they're going to have to try to solve it again this offseason. And what choices do they make? That to me is the more important conversation, rather than revisiting whether or not, they could have, should have gone after Lamar Jackson. That's water under the bridge as far as I'm concerned. What about the current issues here in Atlanta? Now, I'm not particularly optimistic about the Falcons being able to solve their quarterback situation this offseason, but it's going to be fun to watch. We'll have plenty of interesting conversations and debates all offseason long, right? And I think one of those conversations debate is going to be whether or not the Falcons choose to go after a rookie quarterback or a veteran quarterback to solve the problem. Now, personally, I think going for the rookie makes sense for the same reasons why, we sat here 11 months ago making the case for why we should get engaged with Desmond Ridder rather than going all in on Lamar Jackson. And, part of that is the long-term benefits of, hey, if you actually hit on a rookie, those long-term benefits should be obvious, right? In terms of solving your quarterback problem for, the next decade plus. And then you also have the short-term benefits of, you free up money so that you can go out and use those money and those assets to solve other problems, free agent dollars, all that stuff and more, rather than giving that all to the quarterback, right? Now, the problem with going for a rookie is there's inherently more risk involved to it. Rookies, you got a low hit rate on drafting rookie quarterbacks. Rookies tend to be much more volatile than veterans tend to be. And with the Falcons, Arthur Smith and company, potentially, assuming that they're still around this offseason, we'll talk throughout today's episode with that assumption in mind. So I do want to make that clear that we're operating under the assumption that Arthur Smith will be back next year. Obviously, if he's not, that changes the math and the rhetoric. But in a make or break year that 2024 would be, do you want to go with a more volatile option in a rookie? So that probably potentially could push the Falcons in the direction of looking for a veteran, especially if, as a plan B. More on that a little bit later. But I think another factor that could push them in that direction is you look at the current team and you say, look at the defensive success versus the offensive success. And, what does the defense have? A lot of veteran leadership at key positions. What does the offense not have is a lot of veteran leadership at key positions outside of like Jake Matthews and Chris Lindstrom. That's not the issue on defense with Grady Jarrett, Calais Campbell, and David Onyema, Caden Ellis, Jesse Bates, etc. Like, those are 5 out of the 6 best players sort of, players on your defense, right? So I could see the Falcons basically deciding like, oh, we just need to go out there and get more veteran leadership, and that will solidify our offense in the same ways it solidified the defense. Again, whether they're correct in that decision remains to be seen. But who could they possibly sign as veteran quarterbacks? You got Kirk Cousins, you got Ryan Tannehill. Both of those guys are 36 years old. Cousins is coming off an Achilles injury. Tannehill's coming off a number of injuries. Either one of those options to me are not great options because it feels like you're just kind of rewinding the clock to back to 2021 with Matt Ryan when he was 36 years old and, on the decline. Now, I'm sure there are plenty of you listening right now that think 2021 Matt Ryan is not a bad option for this team. I don't really agree with that, but, I understand why you think that, right? Is it a better option than the current option? Maybe, but I don't think that makes it a good option, right? But between Cousins and Tannehill, I would take Cousins even coming off his injury 100 times out of 100 over Tannehill. Like, to me, if Tannehill is your plan A or plan B, like that to me is the darkest timeline. I know another player that gets often thrown out there is Kyler Murray. I would be shocked if the Falcons went after Kyler Murray. I don't think, Kyler Murray doesn't throw over the middle. Arthur Smith's offense is kind of built to throw over the middle. That to me is not a marriage that's likely going to work. And Justin Fields is another player that's very popular, at least on Twitter. I don't really see that happening. I don't see the Falcons looking at, Desmond Ridder and being like, okay, if you look at adjusted net yards per attempt or Anya, our sort of preferred quarterback efficiency metric, Desmond Ridder's 22nd. And at a later date, there will be a conversation on whether or not that is falling as far short of expectations as people would lead you to believe based off of the rhetoric surrounding Desmond Ridder. But that's a after the season plays out conversation. But Desmond Ridder is the 22nd most efficient quarterback in the NFL. You know what Justin Fields is? The 25th most efficient quarterback in the NFL. And I don't see a scenario where the Falcons are like, what our solution is? A less efficient passer. Right? So, to me, the Falcons going after Justin Fields is just screaming the Carolina Panthers going after Sam Darnold to me. But I know there's going to be a lot of people that disagree with that assessment. So you're probably sitting there going, okay, Aaron, you don't like any of these options potentially. What would you suggest? Well, I think the Falcons plan A is probably the same plan A that I would likely have. Again, it's December. We'll see how this changes over the coming weeks and months. But I think it's probably the trade up for either Drake May out of UNC or Caleb Williams out of USC. My assumption is that this regime would prefer May over Williams, but that's, it's early in the process. So we'll have that conversation at a later date. But, the problem with that is it takes two to tango, as they say, and you're not guaranteed to get a dance partner as far as the draft trade up goes. So then if I'm speculating on what the Falcons plan B is, again, I think it's probably Cousins, and then plan C would be Ryan Tannehill. If it was me, my plan B would probably be just sign a cheap veteran like Jacoby Brissett or Tyrod Taylor and then draft a quarterback, whether that's a day one quarterback or a day two quarterback remains to be seen. And a big part of the process that I'm going to undergo over the coming weeks and months is basically finding that alternative draft option at quarterback that isn't Drake May or Caleb Williams that I would feel at least somewhat compelled to be like, I like that guy. I'd be willing to sort of toss the keys of this team's future to that guy. As of December 26th, 2023, when I'm recording this, I don't have that guy. I'm not in love with any of these other prospects. It's not that I hate them or anything like that. I'm just like, I'm not at a point where I'm like, yeah, that's the guy. That's my next, Falcons quarterback who I believe wholeheartedly in can be their starting quarterback for the next 7 to 10 years. I haven't gotten there. Now, obviously, between December 26, 2023 and April 26, 2024, or whenever closer to the draft time, that's when that decision will be made, that opinion will be formed. But that's kind of how I feel about Jaden Daniels and the other QB3 options. So we'll see about that. But later in today's episode, we're going to talk more about Arthur Blank's decision to potentially keep Arthur Smith and whether or not that's a poor decision and should be reflective of his capabilities as the owner of the team, Arthur Blank, that is. But my general feeling is right now, and again, this is today, not saying this is going to be my opinion tomorrow, but if you're going to draft a quarterback and you're not getting Drake May or Caleb Williams, then I don't think punting on the quarterback situation until next year is necessarily a bad move. We'll see how it plays out, obviously, but I don't say inherently that's a poor choice at the Falcons. And it's not because the usual of like, oh, next year's quarterback class is going to be better. I just, if we're assuming Arthur Smith is sticking around for another year and that 2024 is probably going to be his final year, again, maybe you're not ready to make that assumption now. I think the one upside of bringing a new head coach waiting until 2025 is, potentially that coach will get a better opportunity to find his long-term solution at the quarterback position than the Falcons sit as of today. So we'll see, right? Like, I don't want to necessarily hire that new coach and be like, well, you got to make it work with Jaden Daniels or JJ McCarthy or whoever the Falcons choose, Bo Nix or whoever, that Quinn Ewers. I don't know. I'm just saying names, right? Again, don't put too much stock into that. But the idea of like, okay, well, it's so similar to what, Matt Nagy taking Justin Fields and then Matt Eberflus being like, well, I guess we got to make it work with Justin Fields and, kind of, I'm not going to say wasting, but like, now that coaching staff is basically in the same predicament that Arthur Smith and company is, which is they're on the hot seat and they got to get the quarterback right, all that stuff and more, right? And so you don't want to do that for the next coaching staff. So, now I'm sure you're sitting here going, but like, Aaron, if you're not confident Smith is going to be back in 2025, and even if they did trade up for May or Williams, you wouldn't necessarily change that opinion. Aren't you doing that? Well, I think May and Williams are the type of prospects, at least so far, that are the type of perennial top 5 quarterback prospects that you could go back to any draft over the last 5 to 10 years, put May and Williams in those drafts, and they would probably be a top 5 pick in most of those drafts, if not all of them, as opposed to other players that, some years might not even be a first round pick, that may wind up being top 5 picks this year. And so like, if you're going to hamstring a new coach, I don't think that's really hamstringing them with that caliber of prospect. Now, whether those guys live up to that, that's always the question when it comes to quarterbacks, but there's a lot there to unpack and debate. We'll be talking more about that in the coming weeks and months. Again, none of these opinions are final. So as I said, it's not going to be a boring offseason. We're going to have a very interesting offseason. Whether it's a fun offseason remains to be seen, but we're going to have an interesting offseason. But that's kind of where I'm at with the current quarterback situation. As far as the old quarterback situation with Ridder versus Lamar, like, again, I just felt like that was so many of those arguments are such bad faith that, the choice was Ridder, a defense, 2 first-round picks, and 20% of your salary cap versus Lamar. And again, you can think in those circumstances that going with Lamar is still the better choice than all of those things, but don't be the guy that's like, it's just Ridder versus Lamar, because that's not really what that situation is. But we'll continue today's episode talking more about, Arthur Blank, if he does keep Arthur Smith around, how much criticism does he deserve for that choice? But first, guys, I want to tell you about Gametime, the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, comedy, theater, and music near you. They got killer last minute deals, all in prices, views from receipt, and the best price guarantee. Gametime is taking the guesswork out of buying tickets. And those killer last minute deals means you can buy tickets in seconds right up to the start of the event. Right, all in prices means you're not going to get hit with hidden fees. Views from your seat mean you can see the view from your seat before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. And Game Time's guaranteed means you'll always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, they'll credit you 110% the difference. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. But again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So continuing today's episode, want to plug the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 streaming channel if you want to get the insight into all the news, not only just from NFL, NBA, NHL, MLB, all the sports leagues across the nation, across the world, across the network. Locked On Sports Today 24/7 streaming channel, first of its kind, your team every day. And check out the Locked On Sports Atlanta for that local flavor. They're 24/7 streaming channel as well. So our first question comes from Seattle 6 in the Discord. He says, is Arthur Blank just okay with being mediocre? We have an offensive-minded head coach that has only dialed up over 30 points one time in 3 seasons. I'd like to know how Arthur Blank is handling this compared to other owners of struggling teams over the last decade in regards of making staff changes, obviously. So, Seattle 6, I did not go back and look back at, comparable situations over the last decade to compare, but my guess is, without doing that research, is that probably Arthur Blank is probably going to be a little bit more patient in this circumstance that you outlined with Arthur Smith than your probably average NFL owner, right? And I personally tend to see patience as a virtue when it comes to ownership, but certainly that can be taken on a case-by-case basis. Not all, you don't need to be patient universally, right? So, I think it's going to be fair if and when, as I said before, the Falcons keep Arthur Smith, it's going to be fair to criticize Arthur Blank for that choice. Right. To me, it's very personally reminiscent to the decision to keep Dan Quinn coming off of the heels of the 2019 season going into 2020. And it's very similar to Matt Nagy, Matt Rule, and these other sort of lame duck head coaches as points of comparison, especially those like Nagy and Rule that, by the time they got to the end of year 3 or wherever it was, had not solved the quarterback situation. And that was a dire sort of scenario going into that final year. And ultimately, the Bears chose Justin Fields, the Panthers cycled between, Sam Darnold in year 3 and then Baker Mayfield in year 4. That didn't work out. And so that's part of the reason why, I'm not particularly optimistic that it's going to work out in the Falcons' favor, that Arthur Smith is going to have an outcome that's more favorable than Matt Nagy or Matt Rule, right? So is it possible that Arthur Smith and company figure it out next year? Absolutely. Is it likely? I don't think so. Partially owed to this team's tendency to be inconsistent, and you need them to be consistent, and they haven't been that. And so I don't think that's going to change in year 4. It could, but I don't think it's likely to. And you're going to probably have a much harder schedule next year in 2024 than you did in 2023. So your margin for error is only going to shrink, right? In that regard, when you want it to kind of widen, so to speak, if you're following me. So, I think that's going to lead to Arthur Smith kind of being the front runner to be the first coach fired next year when, FanDuel comes up with those odds. And I would tell you to take those odds. And some of that is owed to the potential when we get to May, when the schedule comes out, because, a lot of that is going to be out of the Falcons' control, because similar to kind of 2020, where you had a very tough start of slate of games to start the season, which contributed to the 0-5 start. Although again, we know the Falcons had 2 epic collapses that they should have at least started that season 2-3 rather than 0-5. But there's a scenario next year where you open up the season with Kansas City, Cincinnati, Detroit, and Philadelphia. And that's going to be a tough obstacle to sort of overcome for a coach in Arthur Smith with that sort of pressure going into the season. So we'll see about that. But all of that to say, the point is, I do think Arthur Blank deserves criticism if he does keep Arthur Smith, but I don't think it's the level of criticism I think he's going to get. I sort of see Arthur Blank, as a B+ owner, right? And I don't think his decision to keep or fire Arthur Smith is going to really affect that grade for me. I know that's going to be the case for a lot of folks. They're going to try to label and say Arthur Blank is a bad owner, that he constantly makes poor choices. Like, he's made mistakes. There are certainly choices that he's made over the last 20 years that we can be critical of. But I think for the most part, he is a good owner. And I don't necessarily agree with the sort of, I think the extreme opinion that you're going to see, the extreme level of criticism that you're going to see for Arthur Blank this offseason, should he keep Arthur Smith, right? I think that is part of the sort of scapegoat reductionist sort of mentality when it comes to trying to find one person to blame your multitude of problems on. And that will be the case with Arthur Blank to some people. I'm just going to tell you, I don't think this is the case. Again, I think it's fair to criticize why, as I laid out all the reasons why it's probably not going to work out. I think that's 1000% fair to basically say, Arthur Blank, why are you doing this to us when, the chances of this working or not? Just rip the Band-Aid off and move on. But I don't think it's like, oh, this is the worst decision that's ever been made in the history of football. Like, as I outlined, there have been plenty of examples of sort of these lame duck head coaches, as you say. And so, see how you're probably asking me to do the research to come up with more examples. And maybe that's something we'll do at the end of the season, but we'll just sort of wait and see on that. But we'll wrap up today's episode talking a little bit more about maybe one of the things that could justify Arthur Blank's decision to keep Arthur Smith around is him reshuffling his coaching staff. And another question, our final question is, what are the chances that we might have a different offensive coordinator, a different play caller next year in Atlanta? And we'll break that down on today's episode of Locked On Falcons. But first, guys, I want to tell you about PrizePicks, the most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. And now that basketball season is here, we love PrizePicks because of their specials league, which allows you, it's a league created specifically to combine projections from two or more players from different sports, different leagues. You can combine college basketball, NBA, NFL, NBA, NHL, NBA, NHL, college football, all that and more, right? And if you have the skills, you can turn $10 into $250 with PrizePicks. It's simple to play. Just pick two or more players, pick more or less on their projected stats, and the more entries you make, the more money you can make, up to 25 times your money. PrizePicks has quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, an enormous selection of player stats. It's why PrizePicks is the #1 daily fantasy sports app. So go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL in lowercase for a first deposit match up to $100. That's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code LockedOnNFL. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. So we are wrapping up today's episode. Hopefully the next episode you guys get will be an all 22 review. If not, then it will be a crossover Thursday, followed by hopefully an all 22 review. We shall see. However, but continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day so that you can get updates on that sort of thing. But our last question also comes from a Discord user. And again, if you want to submit questions, sort of the priority is Locked On Falcons insiders, Discord users, and then everybody else, right? Probably emailers, if I'm being honest, because I don't check the email as often as I should. But generally, when I see a question, I go, okay, I'm going to answer that immediately. So anyway, Locked On Falcons insiders, the link in the description below. Discord, link in the description below. Email address is lockedonfalcons@mail.com if you want to have questions answered on future episodes. But, BP Football Talk asks, hey, Aaron, Arthur Smith has had some good games and bad games this year. With that being said, I actually might be one of the few that want him back next year because if we fire him, that means we lose Nielsen as well. I'd hate to start over with a new defensive coordinator next year in a new system. I think if Coach Smith is back, that he shouldn't be allowed to call plays and maybe just have the OC, the offensive coordinator, call them and see how that goes. What's your thoughts? So I will say this. I think it's, as someone who's defended Arthur Smith's play calling all year long, I'm not going to necessarily defend it, but let's just talk about what I think is likely, right? Not necessarily my opinion on what should happen as far as play calling. I think it's highly doubtful that Arthur Smith is not calling plays in 2024, right? Again, operating on the assumption that he is back in 2024, right? That it's based off of the idea that if Arthur Smith is going to go down, he's going to go down swinging, right? Like the captain's going to go down with the ship, right? And sort of ceding control to another captain, I don't think it's going to happen in sort of a make-break year. There's probably not going to have anybody internally become the play caller because no current assistant has extensive play calling experience outside of Arthur Smith on this offensive coaching staff. which I'm sure some people think is a contributing factor to the struggles on offense. It's all on Arthur Smith, and that's not a great place to be if you're, which is, I think it's fair. It's fair, but I think if they are going to hire a new offensive coordinator, that's probably going to be someone from outside the organization. And again, I think it's a big ask to basically cede control of your fate in a make or break year to somebody else, right? Like if you were on the hot seat at your job, would you basically put all your trust in one of your coworkers to basically go out there and save my job? Probably not, right? So I think that's going to be the situation with the Falcons and why you won't see Arthur Smith cede play calling to somebody else. Now, you could see a reshuffling of the coaching staff, especially on offense and probably on defense, because Nielsen is probably going to remake it a little bit to fit his image a little bit more. You typically see that with new defensive coordinator, with any new coordinators, right, going into their second season. One suggestion of offensive reshuffling that I've put out there for at least the Discord users in the past was, maybe one scenario. Again, not saying this is the scenario, but if I do prophetically project this in the future, I will claim all credit that I am a prophet. And if I get any of these things wrong, then I will just say, like, how can you expect, someone to be prophetic or anything like that? You throw enough stuff at the wall, some of it sticks, and you take credit for the stuff that sticks. It's basically the secret to being a Falcons prophet. But that being said, one of those scenarios is you move TJ Yates from the wide receiver coach to quarterback coach. Then you hire someone like Sean Jefferson, currently with the Carolina Panthers, as your wide receiver coach, formerly coached alongside Arthur Smith in Tennessee. Then you bring in maybe a new passing game coordinator, and who that person is, no idea. But one candidate could be Chandler Henley, who is currently the assistant quarterbacks coach for the Miami Dolphins, formerly the assistant offensive line coach back in 2021 under Arthur Smith in Atlanta, was also an offensive quality control coach in Tennessee when Arthur Smith was the play caller there. Also, his other weird connection to the Falcons is he was the position coach of Falcons legendary tight end Jaden Graham at Yale many years ago. So, maybe you bring him back. Maybe he brings a little bit of that, Miami mojo and sort of the motion and the speed. And that's one way that the Falcons try to improve Arthur Smith's play calling, by basically, let's get more speed out there. Let's, find ways to maximize our motion to sort of get mismatches. And that's going to be a way that we can make the leap in terms of being that explosive offense that we're going to need to be next year. I think if this team is going to be successful, that's another reason why I'm skeptical, because like the one criticism I've had of Arthur Smith from jump is how good is he at scheming up explosive plays. The body of work is not that impressive. And anybody who knows me knows, like, that's kind of how I judge offensive coordinators. It's like, are you good at scheming up explosive plays? Yes, you're a great offensive coordinator. No, you're okay, right? Like, you're Dirk Cutter, you're Sark, you're Arthur Smith. Like, it doesn't mean that you're bad at your job. It just means you're not good enough. It's the same thing with quarterbacks, right? Like, you can be, everybody wants Patrick Mahomes. Everybody wants, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Dak Prescott, whoever, is at the top of your quarterback rankings. But more often than not, you're going to find yourself settling for like Kirk Cousins or Jared Goff or Derek Carr, right? And like, those aren't good I'm not going to say that. Those aren't the best options, right? But like, you can do a lot worse than that. And that's kind of what I feel like Arthur Smith is as a play caller, and Sark was. And, Dirk Cutter, I called him the Andy Dalton, the play caller. So again, there's certainly a lot of room for improvement there. But I feel like you're better off with Sark and Arthur Smith than you were with Dirk. But again, that's all relative. Anyway, that's it, guys. So I hope that answers your question. We might see a reshuffling of the offensive coaching staff, but I doubt we're going to see a new play caller. So again, all of these are topics that we will discuss quite a bit over the coming weeks and months. Because again, none of these topics are just like, hey, we solve that problem in 5 minutes on a podcast. Like, it's like, that's a whole hour in of itself on the podcast, and we got to spread that out over multiple days. But that's going to do it for us, guys. Hopefully our next episode will be an all 22 review. If not, then it's going to be a crossover Thursday with Locked On Bears host Lauren Cox. Check out Locked On Sports Today, Locked On Sports Atlanta, 24/7 streaming channel. They're all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every